Popular representations of sex discrimination in the U.S. most often depict women as victims of discrimination and harassment in the workplace. Common images include women being subject to sexist hiring practices, being sexually harassed by their superiors, or being repeatedly passed over for promotion. All of these practices are examples of sex discrimination, but Title IX defines sex discrimination much more broadly than discrimination on the basis of female gender. Sex discrimination under Title IX includes sexual and gender-based harassment, including harassment on the basis of gender identity and gender expression. This includes discrimination and harassment targeting trans and gender non-conforming students. Discrimination and harassment on the basis of pregnancy. Title IX requires universities to provide accommodations to pregnant students, such as providing pregnancy-related leave without penalty. Sexual assault. Having or attempting to have sexual contact with another individual without consent. Sexual exploitation. Purposefully taking sexual advantage of another person without consent, such as video recording someone engaging in a sexual act without their consent. Relationship and interpersonal violence. Any act of violence or threatened act of violence against a person who is or has been involved in a sexual, dating, domestic, or other intimate relationship with that person, or against a person with whom the person accused of violence has sought to have such a relationship. Stalking, which occurs when a person engages in a course of conduct toward another person under circumstances that would cause a person to fear bodily injury or experience substantial emotional distress. Retaliation. Title IX bars retaliation against individuals who pursue university remedies and grievance procedures. Retaliation includes threatening, intimidating, harassing, or any other conduct, such as purposefully interfering with, threatening, or damaging an individual's academic and/or professional career, that would discourage a reasonable person from engaging in activity protected under this policy. More detailed information about each of these types of discrimination can be read in the policy section on the Title IX website. At its most basic level, Title IX is designed to ensure equity and access. Under Title IX, educational institutions, including private universities like Brown, must ensure equal access to educational programming, including campus employment, athletics, and university-affiliated funding opportunities. Sex discrimination comes in many forms, and anyone can be the target of discrimination. Institutional versus interpersonal sex discrimination. Keeping in mind that Title IX prohibits sex discrimination in educational programming, let's begin with the different ways discrimination can impede access. Discrimination can be institutional, meaning that the university's informal and formal practices disadvantage some members of the community over others on the basis of sex. Discrimination can also be interpersonal, meaning that the behavior of an individual or group of individuals can create a hostile working environment for some on the basis of sex. A hostile environment can significantly impede an individual's ability to work and learn. In order to further understand this distinction, let's take the example of sexual harassment. Based on Brown's participation in the American Association of Universities survey in spring 2014, we know that the most common Title IX violation experienced by graduate and medical students during their time at Brown was sexual harassment. The survey identified different types of interpersonal behaviors that could be considered sexual harassment, such as making inappropriate comments regarding body, appearance, or sexual activity, or repeatedly making romantic or sexual advances towards someone. The data gathered by the survey represent the prevalence rates of one form of interpersonal discrimination, sexual harassment. We also know from the survey that graduate and medical students were far more likely than undergraduates to identify their harasser as a faculty advisor or supervisor. If the university systematically refused to investigate sexual harassment complaints brought against faculty members, that would be an example of institutional sex discrimination related to sexual harassment.
The following scenarios are hypothetical and do not reflect the policies of Brown University.
Other examples of interpersonal discrimination as recognized by Title IX include the faculty leader running your doctoring small group consistently makes what they believe to be humorous comments about how having such attractive, young students in the program keeps distracting them from that day's lesson plan or activity. Your department chair refuses to sign off on your pregnancy leave, despite the fact that the university policy entitles you to 12 weeks of leave. A colleague whose behavior is becoming increasingly controlling threatens to tell everyone in your cohort that you are transgender if you don't go on a date with them. A faculty member who works in your area asks if you want to collaborate on a project. When you start meeting, they try to turn conversation from work to romantic and sexual topics. Every time you try to steer the conversation back to work, they remind you how working together will benefit your career. Other examples of institutional sex discrimination under Title IX include a program that has an unofficial policy of only interviewing male applicants. The university maternity leave policy applies only to pregnant female graduate and medical students, excluding pregnant students who do not identify as female, as well as primary caregivers of infants. The university refuses to investigate all complaints alleging harassment of trans students. A program that has an informal but universally applied practice of forcing pregnant students to take a year off, significantly delaying students' progress and setting up a two-tiered track within the program. Sex discrimination and difference. While Title IX allows for a broad definition of sex discrimination, it does not fully capture how sex discrimination can have differing impacts based on other aspects of identity. Experiences of sexual harm, as well as experiences of remedying sexual harm, can vary depending on someone's race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, ability, citizenship status, and religion. They can also vary depending on one's status within the university itself, such as whether you have a PhD, MA, or are a medical student. These aspects of identity, and the corresponding systems that organize our society, fundamentally shape gender and sex, the two characteristics that Title IX is meant to protect by prohibiting sex discrimination. To better understand how sex discrimination is impacted by other forms of difference, let's return to the example of sexual harassment. Of the students who reported instances of sexual harassment, those who identified as underrepresented minorities had higher rates of sexual harassment than non-URM students, who also reported sexual harassment. This difference in prevalence rates indicates the compounded vulnerability students of color face in instances of sex discrimination. Longstanding racist stereotypes about the hypersexuality of non-white bodies contribute to a culture that sees people of color as sexually available. This context may cause individuals to feel more entitled to sexualize students of color. The underrepresentation of Black, Latinx, Native American, and Asian Pacific Islander students in graduate programs and medical school can also contribute to vulnerability, because individuals might think these students will be unlikely to report discriminatory behavior so as not to further marginalize their status within the university. Additionally, students who identified as transgender, genderqueer, gender non-conforming, or indicated an identity not listed on the survey, as well as students who identified as non-heterosexual, reported the highest rates of sexual harassment, illustrating how individuals perceived as straying from masculine and feminine gender norms and/or heterosexuality are more likely to encounter harassing behaviors that question, challenge, sexualize, or degrade their identity. These students might also be considered unlikely to come forward in order to avoid being singled out. Additional examples of how sex discrimination intersects with other forms of bias are your colleague, who always finds a way to steer the conversation towards sex, singles you out to ask about your sex life and birth control methods. They know that you abstain from premarital sex due to your religious beliefs. A visiting professor repeatedly makes passes at the only out, queer, Black woman in your cohort, saying things like, "A white male academic partner could really help legitimate your career." A faculty member threatens to sue you for defamation if you report their sexual harassment to the university. You stay silent because you cannot afford legal representation, and you're worried a lawsuit might compromise your visa, not to mention your medical career. A graduate student you met at a GSC social begins sending you Facebook messages, asking if you would ever consider dating a white woman, and expressing her long-standing desire to see what it would be like to sleep with an Asian woman. An administrator you are working with to establish a mentorship program for graduate students of color begins asking about your dating life, and every time you meet, they have a new question about how sexual relationships work for someone who uses a wheelchair. You humor them not only because you don't want to risk plans for the mentorship program, but also because they are married to your PI and you don't want to disrupt things at work. Cultivating a supportive and equitable workplace. Now that you understand a bit more about the various forms discrimination and harassment can take, you will be better equipped to address these incidents should you encounter them during your time at Brown. If you are on the receiving end of discriminatory or harmful behavior, please revisit the first video or go to the Title IX website to learn more about your options. Remember, There is no single right way to proceed after experiencing harassment or discrimination. Each individual must decide what makes sense for them at any given time. If you do happen to witness any of the things discussed in this video, however, there are things you can do to help build a more equitable environment. As evidenced by the examples, these incidents usually happen between people who already have some kind of relationship, whether it be professional, friendly, or newly acquainted. If you happen to be present during an exchange, it is likely you will know both or all parties involved. Being part of a familiar social situation might make it easier to step in than if you saw something happen between strangers. But keep in mind that all of the following tactics can be used whether or not you know someone. If you see someone being harassed, you can interrupt and change the direction of the conversation so the focus is no longer on the person being harassed. Take a moment to pull aside the person who was participating in discriminatory behavior and tell them how their actions made you uncomfortable and could be contributing to a hostile work environment for their peers. Enter the conversation directly to say that the comments are making people uncomfortable. Take a moment to pull aside the person who is being harassed to let them know you saw what happened and ask them if they are okay, or if they want support addressing the issue. Speak to your department chair, academic advisor, trusted mentor, or the Title IX office about steps your program can take to establish an equitable work environment. Look for more detailed information about the office, processes, and resources on our website.